The gig economy is full and hiding mass unemployment. Why 3 million people became Uber drivers. The gig economy has never exactly been flawless, but some recent trends are throwing off a delicate balancing act between workers and customers that might accidentally be exposing some much deeper underlying problems with our entire economic system. On the surface, our unemployment rate looks really good right now. Sure, it has trended up slightly in the wake of a long string of mass layoffs across multiple industries, but by zooming out and looking at the bigger picture, we can see it's still hovering around all-time historical lows. Sounds great, right? Well, it's no secret anymore to anyone paying attention that jobs data has had some serious reliability problems in recent years, and one of the biggest blind spots in this data is people moving into the gig economy instead of becoming formally classified as unemployed. For a lot of people who have lost their traditional jobs, it's actually quicker and often easier to register as an Uber driver than it is to officially register as unemployed with the government, and you only really need to look at the numbers to see this pattern is happening on a massive scale. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, over the last 5 years, the total number of people classified as unemployed has fallen by about 3 million people. Which sounds like fantastic news, but over that exact same time frame, the number of active Uber drivers has increased by roughly 3 million people, according to company financial disclosures. That's not a coincidence. Now, to play devil's advocate for a moment, even if these gig jobs aren't the best quality employment, having readily available and highly flexible work with extremely low barriers to entry could actually be considered a good thing when the alternative is people going straight onto unemployment benefits with no income whatsoever. And we will explore that nuance. But the problem right now for the workers entering the gig economy is that there is a rapidly growing roster of drivers looking to compete for work and a shrinking pool of customers that are still willing to pay premium prices for delivery services. A lot of the data surrounding gig work and even just regular employment is disjointed, vague, and often downright counterintuitive to understand. Even something as simple and fundamental as what it actually means to be employed is probably going to be different for you as a regular person than it is to the statisticians putting all of these official numbers together. On top of that complexity, when you think of gig work, you are probably thinking specifically about people delivering food or driving people around in their cars as fake taxis. But depending on which organization is collecting the data, the definition can also extend to renting out Airbnb properties or even people like me here running a YouTube channel as self-employment. When a metric becomes a goal in itself, it's no longer a useful measure because the groups involved will try to influence it in ways that benefit them rather than reflecting reality. The gig platform companies want to report that they have lots of people working for them to show investors and regulators how important they are to the economy and their stakeholders. The media wants big dramatic changes in job numbers, one way or another, to make for compelling headlines that drive clicks. Politicians want to ignore the gig industry altogether so that they can keep on pretending the job market is fantastic and take credit for low unemployment. This just adds additional murkiness to an already very messy collection of numbers, which can make it really hard to see what is actually happening to a majority of the workers in these jobs, which is, let's be honest, mostly people who couldn't find a better job elsewhere and are doing gig work out of necessity rather than choice. So, to unravel this complicated situation, there are really 3 critical components that need to be understood. First, the fundamental platform economics that have facilitated the explosive growth of the gig economy. Second, what these services have covered up and hidden in the traditional job market data. And third, what happens when they can't cover it up anymore. Now, that first point is really just about understanding a delicate balancing act. A platform like Uber Eats or DoorDash coordinates transactions between 3 parties: a service provider, which is the delivery driver, a goods provider, which is the restaurant making the food, and a consumer, which is you poking at pictures of cheeseburgers on your phone at 11 p.m. when you're too lazy to cook. If Uber Eats wants to make more money as a business, it either needs to charge you the customer more, pay their delivery drivers less, take a larger percentage cut from the restaurant making the food, or just facilitate more total transactions. In the early days of these services, they were almost exclusively focused on that last strategy. expanding their user base as rapidly as possible. This meant that on any given transaction, they would actually pay more, combined to the restaurant and delivery driver, than they were charging the customer, just to attract as many of these three parties onto their platform as possible. Back around 6 years ago, when these businesses were still in their blitzscaling growth phase, customers would get heavily subsidized food that was often cheaper than ordering directly in person from the restaurant. Restaurants would get generous revenue splits that made the platforms attractive, and drivers were paid well above minimum wage even after accounting for their hidden costs like gas, vehicle maintenance, and depreciation. But these good times for everyone were all financed by aggressively burning venture capital dollars. Now, to play devil's advocate again, this strategy is actually not that unusual when building out a two-sided or three-sided marketplace from scratch. Customers won't spend money on the app if there are no restaurants available to buy from. Restaurants won't register on a platform that has no customers to serve. And drivers won't waste their time if there is no food to be delivered and no money to be made. So to get things started and overcome this chicken and egg problem, the market maker usually does need to sweeten the deal in every direction simultaneously, even if it means losing money. Nowadays, their strategic mission has fundamentally changed from growing the number of transactions to growing how much profit they extract from those transactions. But how much they can push on each participant really depends on how hard each group is to replace. All of these groups are still growing in absolute numbers, but the growth rates tell a very different story. While total revenue collected from customers increased by around 35% in the last 2 years, the total number of active gig workers on these platforms increased by around 80% over the same time period. This would mean that even if there were no changes whatsoever in how this revenue was divided up between the parties, there is simply less money per driver on average, even without considering the effects of inflation reducing purchasing power. But the real point here is that drivers have become by far the easiest group in this triangle to replace. So it's easier for Uber to cut costs from them without destabilizing their entire market ecosystem. Now, I know that this is a lot of numbers to confirm what you probably already intuitively knew. Pay and working conditions for the most common types of gig work are getting measurably worse over time. But by understanding these underlying numbers and trends, you can see how this can very quickly become a dangerous feedback loop, especially if customers can no longer justify spending twice as much on their food to have it hand-delivered across town by someone making less than minimum wage. Now, maybe this could be written off as pure speculation from people who have spent too long staring at company financial statements, except for the fact that in a lot of markets around the world, it's already happening on a large scale, and the results have not been pretty at all. Okay, so as the gig economy platforms are playing this little optimization game, the perfect outcome for the company in the middle here trying to maximize their own bottom line and shareholder value would be a large group of people with a lot of disposable cash who are not very price sensitive on one side, and an even bigger group of people over here without much negotiating power who just desperately need whatever money they can get. And oh, would you look at that coincidence? It's a statistic you are probably all getting sick of hearing me repeat in every video. The top 10% of households are now doing a record 50% of all consumer spending, while the bottom 60% of households are doing a record low of just 20% of spending. This growing economic divide is not great for society in general, but for a company like Uber, it's been a golden opportunity to squeeze more money for objectively worse service out of wealthy customers, while simultaneously squeezing more work for less compensation out of its independent contractors. Also, let's be completely honest with ourselves. A lot of that gap between what customers pay and what drivers receive is being bridged by pushing for tips much harder as well. For the first 3 years of the company's existence, Uber didn't even have a direct in-app tipping option because the company itself publicly called the practice tacky and unnecessary. Today, tipping is the expectation, and it's pushed very aggressively through the app interface. First-hand reports from drivers and restaurants have backed up what the big-picture numbers are suggesting. A lot of locations are doing record volumes of deliveries in terms of total orders, but individual drivers are finding it increasingly hard to find consistent deliveries or rides, which means they can spend hours a day just waiting around for an opportunity to work and earn money. When they do finally get jobs, it's clear that the platform is taking a much larger share of the total pie. Like this example of a $64 ride here in Los Angeles, paying out just $12.43 to the driver who actually provided the service. Of course, This is just one anecdotal example, but it is a pretty damning one that illustrates the broader trend. Another factor that has allowed these companies to squeeze harder from every direction is interest rates rising. For a while, competition was actually quite fierce in the delivery gig work space, as dozens of regional startups tried to take market share away from the primary dominant players. Today, most of them have either become the incumbents themselves, been acquired by the incumbents, or they have gone out of business entirely. The blitzscaling business model of burning billions of investor dollars until cementing dominant market share only really worked in a low interest rate environment where it didn't cost much to just keep on piling in more cash indefinitely. If a competitor wanted to enter the market today to offer a better service or pay gig workers more competitively, they would not only need to cover their operating costs while taking market share, they would also need to cover interest payments that would be 3 times higher than they were back when a lot of today's incumbents were doing the exact same thing. Now, where this situation could get really bad for everyone is what could happen if widespread job losses continue across the economy. If even more people are forced into the gig economy out of desperation, that would mean that even more people would end up competing for the exact same limited number of gigs. And that's without even considering that if people lose their regular well-paying jobs and end up delivering for Uber Eats to survive, they obviously won't have as much disposable money to spend on ordering from Uber Eats themselves. Now, this process alone is actually not that unusual economically. It's basically how every demand-side economic downturn in history happens. Businesses lay off people to cut costs, so households spend less money on goods and services. So business revenue falls further. So businesses are forced to lay off even more people. It's a vicious cycle. If anything, it could almost be argued that gig work like this offers an additional layer of economic protection to people who lose their traditional jobs, which is kind of what is happening right now in the economy. The problem is that if this becomes widespread enough, it can cover up and mask the problem for a lot longer than it would otherwise take for society to realize something might be going seriously wrong. And if things do go very wrong economically, the gig economy offers far less friction for this negative feedback loop to spin out of control. Typically, traditional businesses need to fill out a lot of paperwork and follow procedures to lay people off. It makes them look bad to investors and the public. And they will also need to rework internal processes to operate with fewer staff. Yeah, sure, they still do mass layoffs, but it's not an instantaneous or painless process. This means we at least have time to see something going wrong in the economy before it becomes a full-blown crisis. For gig workers, all of this can happen instantaneously and automatically through algorithms without any human oversight. If the apps are getting fewer orders from customers, drivers automatically get fewer jobs and less surge pricing without any formal notification. The automated nature of their employment throws accelerant into the mix anytime the economy loses its footing. Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and companies like them are now collectively some of the largest employers in America. And if Uber drivers were counted as actual employees rather than independent contractors, Uber would individually be the largest employer in the entire world, easily beating out the largest defense departments and more traditional massive employers like Walmart. This is also just counting the people working in the largest and most obvious sectors of the gig economy. We have covered this story before, but starting around 5 years ago, there was a massive, unexplained increase in the number of new businesses being registered in America. Now, spoiler alert, this was not because people suddenly became more entrepreneurial or had great business ideas. It was mostly because people had lost their regular employment and were registering a company or LLC to do gig work for tax purposes. Fiverr, Etsy, Amazon Flex, and various other platforms also saw a massive uptick in people desperately selling their services. Even the number of videos uploaded to YouTube expanded significantly at this time, according to research published in academic journals. As people were looking for new ways to make money, the challenges faced by individuals working at the mercy of the gig economy are now well understood and well documented in media coverage. But what we may soon figure out is that even for the people who never individually have to experience those harsh conditions, the gig economy could still become a big macroeconomic problem for all of us. In fact, it's kind of already happened in other countries. China's gig economy might represent a glimpse into our own future, and that future is bleak. As a result of various factors like headwinds from the real estate and financial industries as well as a glut of recent university graduates with no job prospects, the youth unemployment rate in China got so bad that the government simply stopped posting that data publicly.